Hello, everybody. The obligatory introduction to who I am. I did 10.5 years at VeriSign, so that was before anybody called it the cloud. We were global PKI and .com and .net. Did post-breach consulting at Microsoft. I was a CISO at a huge insurance company. Then the part that's relevant here, I was the chief security officer over at FireEye when the Solarwinds stuff happened. I recently took a new job at Solarwinds. I've been there about a month. I'm sorry. Took a new job at Salesforce. That's only been there about a month and a half, so that one's pretty new. Two things. I'm not going to be sharing any information that FireEye hasn't said publicly, just to say that one. However, I did talk to over 700 customers about this incident, so I'm really clear as to what's public and what's not. The second part of this one, we don't have as many people in here live. This is pretty likely to end up being more of a recorded session because it's Sunday, right, middle of the afternoon. But I really am actually hoping for questions. These kinds of talks always go way better when there's interactivity. And I mean that probably more than most of the presenters you would have. I don't know whether they're able to just come off mute and ask questions. If not, type them into the chat. It is nearly always better for you to just ask in the middle of something. Don't hold your questions till later, because we'll be in the middle of context at that point. Now, what I'm expecting to do here is I'll lay out like what happened in the Solarwinds breach, and specifically what are the way that links into different career tracks, because depending on who it is that is viewing this, you'll have a completely different take on how it would affect your career and what jobs you would get, or how that one goes. So while the actual description of the breach is actually pretty cool, I'm going to kind of constantly be peppering that into like which parts of the organization would do what parts. I find that especially with university audiences, you end up with a lot of people that go like, oh, I want to do cyber because it's awesome. And I agree, by the way, I agree, it's awesome. But it's also insanely broad. When we were talking about this one before this one started, cybersecurity is one of those areas where everything changes all the time. And that is like literally one of the best parts of what we're doing. So the example that I usually give for that is about 3 years ago, there was no ransomware in the world. And now it's everywhere. And that kind of we just adapt. It's what we do, right? The 0-day stuff that comes out, the way that we have to change our careers or update our knowledge or whatever, that is absolutely a feature of what we do. Whereas if you think the Cisco switching and routing guy, sure, they've got new updated Cisco models, but he's been doing basically the same thing for 20 years. Right? Like the thinking is different. All the really good ones would have been moved off into cloud spaces. They would have been like SRE engineers for Amazon installations and that kind of stuff. And that would be the new modern like updating of skills. But the person that's still doing Cisco right now, it's all very good. There's still a ton of data centers around. It's just less, I don't know, creative, less evolving than the stuff in cyber. The downside is in cyber, we get our teeth kicked in by bad guys all the time, just the way it goes. So I'll just sort of start with what happened. So when the SolarWinds thing occurred, the original incident that there are public blog posts on this one. The original incident that happened was actually not like when the very first thing happened at SolarWinds. You will hear a lot of companies that are basically lying in their marketing about what they say they did or did not catch. Nobody caught it. Not a single technology on the planet caught the exposure of what was the initial implant from SolarWinds, and damn near nobody caught anything even on after the dropper and then the individual piece of malware. There are a lot of companies that found sort of evidence around the edges, like the what happened after they're running around your environment, but nobody had actually alerted on those at the level of what it was, what the actual threat was here. Now, the way that we caught it was all the way back in 2016 there had been a piece of intelligence we had. Mandiant every year does their breach reports called the M-Trends report. I think it's actually coming out soon now. And back in 2016, there was an entry in there where it said that they had caught a financial actor where they're getting into a bank, I think. Some user clicks a bad link that, he loses access to his account, but the bad guys then went to the self-registration portal and registered their own two-factor auth token. So now it wasn't just I clicked the email and what can the bad guy do before sessions expire? He could now come back whenever he wanted and VPN in as the compromised user. That was pretty bad. The second part of that one, though, what they did next was when they escalated their privileges, this is again back in 2016, they got into Active Directory and they created a fake executive admin, a secretary. And then they just delegated the CEO's email to that secretary because the company would have had a lot of controls around the CEO's account, right? Like literally somebody trying to break in as the CEO. They had no controls looking for like, well, did he get a new admin? Because those kinds of delegations happen all the time. Now, this particular one, they also happened to, that fake secretary ended up having a cell phone in Odessa, Russia, that she was able to, the fake secretary, was able to read the CEO's email for months in this case. That's massive levels of information. And at the time, that was the first time in the world that had happened. And back in 2016, we read that piece of intelligence. I didn't have a way to deal with it at the time. So we said like, all right, how can I trust my two-factor auth tokens better? And the way that we did it was a piece of automation. And so the automation, think Python code effectively. It was, how do you define what a real secretary is? Well, she gets a paycheck. Okay, great. Pull that into the ticket. She's got, she checks into Active Directory at least once a week. She has a corporately delivered laptop that she's using. There's a bunch of other stuff. There was actually one of the things we had, like, is her resume in our recruiting system? And so when the trigger of the event is, a new two-factor auth token is issued, then it goes and pulls all that information automatically. Now, in marketplace terms, you would hear this. Some people call it automation. It's a lot of the SOAR stuff. There's some of this is involved in the XDR discussions, right? So, like when you hear companies like Demisto and Phantom and things like that, that's who you could do this kind of work with. We did it with the FireEye tool. They have an automation called FireEye Security Orchestrator, FSO. And what it did is the trigger was that event, and then it go and grab all that information. And if I had the laptop and I had the paycheck and I had the resume and everything, close the ticket, put 0 human time on it. Literally, I would waste my own staff if I actually worked that ticket like a real SOC ticket. And that was 96% of the time. It was I could trust my two-factor auth token because I wrote a few extra lines of Python code and I had very trustworthy two-factor auth tokens. Now, in this issue, that was how we caught them. The attacker was trying to establish redundant persistence. Think of it as if they had been caught and kicked out, they wanted to be able to VPN in back in and reestablish persistence. That was what started the thread. Now, career terms off of there. There's a chunk of that on the automation itself, the SOAR engineers, how do I take the SIM alert and add the automation? There's a bunch of this on the security operations side of things, like who runs the security operations center, the SOC. How do you not have it just be that you send 10,000 tickets a day at your SOC and overload them? Like all in career terms, that's a whole, like the operations around that does really, really cool stuff. There's also in more senior terms, there's like the incident response experts, right? They typically are either at a really big company where they have enough incidents that they need that, or it's part of their job to do other things. So doing that kind of incident response while you're also the Zeek network guy, or you're the incident response person, and you're also in charge of the architecture as to how do I flow all my logs into Splunk, right? That kind of stuff. The other part of that IR world that's interesting is the consulting side. All of the big 4 consulting companies have breach response. Mandiant is one of the best companies on the planet at doing this one. CrowdStrike does it. There's a bunch of other companies that do this one. I will tell you that the consulting job of that is actually a lot of fun. It's just exactly as adrenaline fueled as you would expect it to be. The downside is that when you're on, and they can be like 14-hour days because you have a Fortune 50 company that just had an issue, and you're the only person that can answer where did it come from, what happened, etc. And by the way, ask questions if you have questions. Now, one other part of this one, and I am wildly proud of this. The person that actually caught the initial event, she's a 24-year-old woman that was on my SOC out of Virginia. This is her first job out of college. So she has a mind for this. She knows how to do the investigation of the remaining 4% of those ones that involve human beings. However, the other part of that that's worth noting is the program was set up in a way for her to know. Most companies that I've talked to don't actually have some way to trust their two-factor auth tokens the same way. We all make risk-based decisions about how we're going to allow different parts of technology. And at nearly every company I've ever heard of, in fact, outside of like classified Department of Defense places, every company I've ever heard of, they all have self-registration portals because we have to. Like the age where it used to be go walk up to the help desk and have them hand you your little hardware token, that's gone. That just doesn't happen anymore. We all took the efficiency off of that, but then that also means that efficiency was now attack surface. That also means when you get into this whole thing, career-wise, that would be the networking person that sets up a really, really hardened way of doing the VPN concentrators. That whole part of it, typically, if you get a normal networking person, it tends to be more, okay, the VPN works. They think uptime or downtime. The hardened part, they usually think patching. In this case, we're talking configuration, and we're talking about overlapping controls. We're talking about a detective control to be able to alert on whether when the normal usage, a self-registration portal used by every tech company on the planet, when that is used the way it is meant to be used, how can I find the evil ones? Because no company ever has sold, here's the red blinky light that goes off when you have one evil one, because it looks the same. It looked exactly the same. Now, next part of the Solarwinds breach, and you can ask questions. The way that they were doing this one is that they had actually set up individual infrastructure for it to come from. Their OpSec, the operational security of the attacker, was extremely good. Like humans are humans. And when you have some of the best breach responders on the planet looking at what the attackers were doing, nearly always they were just acting like human beings that have a 9-to-5 job assigned to break into a certain company, right? Just the way it goes. OpSec is how do they do that in a way that makes it really hard to figure out who it is, or really hard to figure out something happening at all, right? So when typical case, they get in, they compromise some user account, like a standard user account, could be a salesperson, could be somebody in HR. They move laterally in order to figure out, okay, how do I figure out what else is going on? Then they'll escalate privileges to something useful. They want to be the mail admin. They want to be the database administrator. They want to go for domain admin credentials, right? OpSec is how do you do that lateral traversal and the escalation of privileges in ways that looks like normal people doing their job, right? While this is not actually the way it happened on the SolarWinds breach, imagine it as somebody clicks an email, they lose access to their HR person account. You register the two-factor auth token. Now I can VPN in as the HR token. Well, in VPN land, it is actually correct for you you'll log in with your corporate account, the account you check email on, and then you are going to switch users over to your admin account, because you would never have your admin account be on the raw internet, right? And you can now have good controls as to who's allowed to switch to which admin account, for example. In investigative terms, that actually makes it hard to do the investigation, because it's not just who logged into the VPN, it's then where did they go and what credentials did they log on someplace else. So if it's, Jennifer, the HR person, that then switches credentials over to Bob, the engineer, that linkage is actually not a normal thing. It's not just as simple as saying, okay, the evil logon was from Jennifer, the HR person. Go search Jennifer's account usage everywhere. It doesn't work that way, right? That kind of, how do I tie this down to individual VPN sessions and be able to track that down? That's an incredibly rare skill set. It is actually, that's not a common thing. Most companies, question from Anonymous, that's interesting. So how do you track that down? Unfortunately, that's not the sort of thing where you just go like right click something in your SIM and go from there, right? It ends up being, it's pivots, and it's a lot of pivots. So you generally are going off of whatever piece of evil information you have, and like, so for example, if this was, and I'm making up some stuff here on purpose because I'm trying to make sure that I maintain, the secrecy that FireEye should expect, right? Let's say that it was Jennifer, the HR person's evil token. We know that token was considered evil. You go like, okay, what else do I know about when that token was registered? Where did they come from? How did they get into? What account was it that they had done access to? You sort of work backwards for how did they get to the self-registration portal, right? That is its own incident response thread, right? You're going to pull all those threads. The other direction, you go like, okay, now that account, now that they're logging on as Jennifer, the HR person, where has that account been used? What else has that account accessed, right? So you're sort of following breadcrumbs the other direction. So let's say they go and they log on to a SharePoint site. Okay, what SharePoint site? What data did they get from the SharePoint site? Which other accounts did that expose? What else happened on that box? Pull a forensic package from that server and be able to say like, okay, did they get to that SharePoint site to use a different exploit in order to be able to go from, HR person to SharePoint admin, right? That is horribly time consuming. And when you see things in the press about breaches, the language companies use in breaches is important. I think personally that FireEye did a pristine job with how they did the communication, the transparency, explaining what happened, all that kind of stuff. The Solarwinds answer was literally 3 days afterwards. They issued a press release and said, we fixed our bug, we're all good. Right, and you go like, okay, no. And that's why everybody talks about this as being the SolarWinds breach, because they screwed it up badly. Their communications were terrible. That's Steve Booth's opinion, not FireEye or Salesforce. Those pivots, those are what you spend the next couple of weeks, 14 hours a day, not working weekend, or not sleeping and working weekends, in order to figure out what happened. How do you get back to effectively patient zero? Okay. So you have to figure out exactly how the attack was executed laterally and vertically. Yes, but change your thinking a little bit. The attack, okay? When you're thinking about a multi-week or multi-month issue, the attack also includes a lot of just reconnaissance, right? Like maybe they're just going to see what Jennifer, the HR person, has access to in internally public, right? So think company confidential in an information classification range. What information does that person have access to? So for example, could they go pull, HR records? Could they go pull source code? Could they log on to systems? Because there are companies where literally they just say, well, once you're on the corporate network, you can log in, go ahead, right? That is really time consuming. And the funny part, almost every place I've ever worked that did this one, they have something called the spreadsheet of death. Everybody names it the same thing. It's the SOD. And that's just where you're keeping track of what are all the threads, what's been chased down. Now, again, career-wise, there's a management rigor to this one where really smart people can get target locked on things. Like you form a hypothesis in your head as to what you think it is, and then you go trying to prove that hypothesis. And that's actually really useful, especially if they're very experienced IR people. It's not so useful when you're going to go 19 steps down a path for one thread and you're not looking at all the other threads, right? So the managerial side of this is, okay, think tech leadership. This would be, I was the chief security officer. The people underneath me would be the VPs and directors that run the security organization. Being able to keep that level of information and how's the investigation going, not how's this one thread into one box, hypothetically the SharePoint box, right? That's actually not easy. Because how do you take somebody that's working 7 days a week for you and say like, okay, that's cool, but I need you to stop what you're on and move on to the next thing, right? In breach response terms, you end up being able to get it down into managing your resources is actually its own critical security path, right? Being able to not destroy your staff and being able to make sure that they're working on useful things sometimes can literally be as simple as you're like, okay, ask that engineer, what's the criteria for when you would stop investigating? Because a lack of evidence usually is hard to let go of. If you find something, it's real easy. You go, yep, I found this account logged in here, or I pulled this forensic package and this box just got compromised 30 seconds after the logon time, right? You're like, okay, got it. Those ones make sense. You can keep going on positive data. Negative data or lack of data is actually really, really hard to step away from, because you don't know whether you just have to keep looking a little farther or was this a dead end, right? The people that I know that do breach response, they absolutely love that. That fight, that back and forth where it's you versus the attacker. That's actually really, really rewarding. The other career term thing of this, think red team. How do you impersonate the bad guy? How do you end up being the person that comes in where 99% of your red team engagement, it's called living off the land. You're going to act like an engineer. They don't run around tripping malware alerts everywhere because that would be noisy and you would get caught. So they would log on during the hours that engineer works. They would try to come from infrastructure that's geographically similar to the engineer, so it doesn't trip your infeasible geography alerting. Like as the red teamer, you're trying to figure out, how can I accomplish my goal without being caught? And accomplishing the goal, there's hundreds of goals, and they're absolutely brilliant. And I have a huge amount of is this part of your CTF? It is actually, like that's awesome. Yeah. That's cool. I've never been a CTF flag before. That's awesome. But how do you do red teaming in a way where you can break into a place that has, like if you're going to break into a Fortune 50 financial company, they have hundreds of millions of dollars of tech that you have to get around, right? And you're not going to do that one by custom handcrafting little 0 days that nobody on the planet has known. Because responsible disclosure says, as a good guy, you should be submitting that over for responsible disclosure. What you would be doing instead is, after you've submitted that, you would create your Metasploit plugin and use that one until that had been patched places, right? Red teaming it actually is a lot of fun, and it's insanely valuable to the companies that hire the red teamers. Those tend to be the companies that have money. The companies that have money also have internal red teamers. Like they would, like I've worked multiple times for places that had an offensive security team. They will piss off basically everybody in your company because they're constantly breaking things, but that's exactly their job. And when I say breaking things, I don't mean causing outages. I mean that they're breaking into things. They're the ones who will tell you, hey, that cool little easy feature you just enabled, here's why you can't use that anymore, roll it back. The red team generally is not the one to do the architectural discussion. They would say, I broke in and here's how I broke in. Now, security architect, what are you going to do about it? Right. So career-wise, you can see that I'm putting multiple different spins and views and all that on security career. Now, back to SolarWinds. Bad guy gets in through, through the way they do. How do you handle disclosure? That's a good question. There major companies have solved this one. Okay. You could get in very serious legal trouble if you were figuring out how to come up with 0 days and not disclosing it, because that's not generally considered a acceptable use kind of a thing. How you handle it, technically, you're allowed to say, I found this bug and I don't care about responsible disclosure. I'm going to stick my proof of concept code on Twitter and make the world a worse place immediately, right? You are actually legally allowed to do that one. everybody in the security industry would shun you. We would all believe that what you're doing is just horrible. That's a monument to your ego, and you literally just made the world a worse place. Instead, the way it normally goes, responsible disclosure is you would take that that bug or 0-day or configuration problem or whatever, and you would submit it to the company that it's relevant for. So if you had found a 0-day in Exchange using a recent one, you would submit that to Microsoft through their bug reporting tool. Sometimes the company won't pay for them. Often they will, and you can make some serious money off of these things. I will tell you actually that's a career path. It's think gig economy for nerds. If you can find that kind of a bug, some of them I just heard there was one that if you can find remote code execution in Microsoft Teams, they're paying $30,000 for every one of the bugs like that. And most of the security nerds are going, that's only worth $30,000. Like that should be in the 100,000 range. There actually are expected market rates for this kind of stuff. One of the ones that I thought was absolutely brilliant, there was a researcher that had found something in a mobile device management, an MDM product, and he submitted it to the MDM company and got paid for it. And then because of the nature of his bug, he was able to find every company that was a customer of them, and think Shodan queries, was able to find other companies that had that product in there. And he submitted all of those through all of the bug bounty programs for all of those companies and got paid for every single one of those, right? He probably made $50,000 on, it was a 7, maybe an 8 on a scale, on the CVSS score, but he was able to cash it in over and over and over again, right? I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Now, I have no idea how many months he had to work to find that thing. A big part of that, the research will be like, you'll see, Patch Tuesday comes out in Microsoft, and you'll see what they patched, and then you can kind of reverse engineer your way back to, okay, what was the exploit that goes, right? And then you go like, okay, so if that's what we found in this one part, what are the other parts of the code that use similar as this? And you try to replicate them over and over again, right? Responsible disclosure usually means you submit it over to the manufacturer of the code and you wait. Generally, it's considered 90 days. That's how almost every company does it. That's how Project Zero does it from Google. I will say Project Zero has broken their own rules several times, where they'll say that like, oh, we'll wait the 90 days unless we think it's really important, which really got down to the ego of the researcher, right? What they say, by the way, and the reason for the waiting 90 days is because after 90 days, that generally means that the company is not paying attention. You found a fundamental security flaw, and your leverage as the researcher is you need to go fix this thing. And if you don't fix this thing, I'm going to embarrass you publicly because you're not fixing the security problems, right? Think about the DEF CON presentations where there was a researcher that figured out how to hack an insulin pump over Wi-Fi. And the device manufacturer said, no, we don't believe this is a risk. And he's like, are you kidding me? You could kill people with an application on your iPad walking down a mall. Like literally, and his demonstration was shooting blue ink out of an insulin pump without even touching it, right? And that company did not feel like patching it until he did his DEF CON presentation, at which point everybody knows he's now a really good hardware hacker. And he was able to say, here's the date I found it, here's when I submitted it, here's the emails they gave me, here's the email where they said, we don't think this is a problem, I think it's a problem. And the researcher was a diabetic. And he's like, I don't want to be wearing a pump that can be hacked like this. And I wouldn't want my child to be wearing a pump like this, right? So responsible disclosure is all of that stuff. There are actually norms for that now can actually make you money. If you happen to be somebody that has a really good time, think black box attacking into things. It's fascinating. It really is fascinating. In this case, where the company says this is not a problem, where do you go from there? You go to the press. A lot of researchers make their name off of companies that do that, because generally if you're going to submit it in as a bug, there's that's how you end up making the money off of it. Nearly every company, when they like Microsoft does this, if you were to find a Microsoft Word 0-day and submit it in there, they've got 90 days to go fix the thing, and it would come out in Office monthly updates, and in their update, they would give your name as credit to it. They would say, you know, this one comes through the researcher here. Thank you very much for the strong work, right? But that's where like your reputation as doing this one. I have worked at companies that on any individual year had submitted 40 or 50% of the 0 days to Microsoft. Right? It's kind of cool when you're literally your resume is being packed up by how many times have you gotten credit in a Patch Tuesday, right? That's not my career. I don't have those skills. I'm more on the blue team side where it's like, okay, I need to build a program that can handle the patching monthly and do it like a grown up, right? A lot of companies do patching really badly. Keep asking the questions, whoever anonymous is. Those are good. They're good questions. All right, back to SolarWinds breach. So we know that the bad guys were in. We had a pretty good idea what was going on. We were in the process of kicking them out. I'm going to skip all those details. They're interesting, but I'm going to skip it just because I don't want to get anywhere close to any secrecy lines. FireEye deserves making sure that I put a lot of effort into maintaining the confidentiality. Back to public information. What we got into next was how do you find patient 0? And you don't always find it. Sometimes the bad guys are so good at cleaning up their tracks that you just end up saying, I know what they did, but I don't know how they initially got in. In this case, the investigation had been sort of circling around the SolarWinds box, meaning like this account had access to SolarWinds, but I don't see anything there, right? And this other account had access to SolarWinds, but I don't see anything there. As we were circling around the thing, we had been doing such incredibly good work. I got to give insane amounts of credit to the Mandiant people. We were down to the part where we were investigating things we weren't sure were even theoretically possible, right? I mean, like literally to the point where we would have to go, if this thing was true, we might have to go craft a 0 day to make this possible, right? I mean, like, so there's an old saying there that says, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And we were chasing the left-handed zebra holding a celery stick. I mean, we were going to some incredibly rare situations. And it got down to, or there had to be something going on with SolarWinds, right? Now, the company that I worked for at the time, FireEye, we had a bit of a superpower in that we had several dozen reverse engineers. Most companies don't. We just kind of got frustrated and said, fine, we're going to reverse engineer the entire SolarWinds installation, every single file that would have been put in there, including pulling some off of backups to find previous versions. When you go through the reverse engineering, like especially when you're going to do an RE at scale like this, you end up being able to see the way they lay out their code. It gets very, very predictable, right? And then we got to one file where they had a chunk of obfuscated code, and I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was 1,000 lines, 4,000 lines of code, very small amount of code that was behaving differently than everything else that they had wrote. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's evil. There are places where like people will obfuscate their code to make it harder for competitors to find things, right? However, this was the only place they had done it, and it just didn't make sense. So we threw some resources at that. When we cracked that one open, like, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, we're sitting there doing this thing, and I was like, oh crap, we found it, right? It would have been a Saturday, because on a Sunday, we had to get a hold of an exec at SolarWinds. We told them, and then later that afternoon, we told the world. And I say we, meaning FireEye. I'm not there anymore. I think that was brilliant. Now, at this point, think of it as we are a security company, and we're telling the whole world what had happened with a breach, but we haven't even gotten to the end of. Sorry, my cat's joining our little conference here. She wants to say hello as she rubs her face on my face. I like my cat too. Her name is Boop, B-O-O-P. She's a little pink naked alien because she's a hairless cat. They at this point, like when we told the world that we were a security company that had had a breach, that was ugly. Like stock prices go down, the vulture lawyers start coming out of the woodwork, right? There's a fairly I don't know, formulaic way that breach companies happen, but the transparency was outstanding, right? Just outstanding, where we said, like, look, something happened and the world needs to know what happened. Now, at this point, what FireEye was also announcing was that we had lost, they had lost some red teaming tools. And this one, the credit goes to the CEO of FireEye, Kevin Mandia. He said, nobody on the planet will be broken into with our tools. Go burn them, and go burn them all. Now, when we told the whole world we lost those tools, they also got in, they were running through VirusTotal. They were helping competitors find these things. We were releasing just hundreds of detections for these tools. We were making these tools as useless as possible. Now, they weren't 0 days. We did the responsible disclosure on everything. But think of them as taking a version of Cobalt Strike and then modifying it to make it harder to detect, right? And in some cases, almost impossible to detect. We were now releasing detections that could be plugged into your endpoint tools. We were helping direct competitors craft their detections for these things, right? When you get them into like a VirusTotal, now free antivirus can find this particular version of a Cobalt Strike tool, for example. That's impressive. That's actually impressive. That means that this whole capability, the red team capability, all of their tools were now useless. Go start over again, right? The interesting part for me also, though, is that technically they didn't legally have to do that. All of the breach response things say, if I lose your data, I have to tell you. We lost our own data, right? They're like mass privacy doesn't apply. GDPR doesn't apply. California SB 1386 does not apply. You don't have to notify the world that you had a breach if all you lost was your own information. Just the ethics of that situation are amazingly good. How do you lose tools? The tools were gotten off an internal server. They were used very, very commonly for different breaches. So they were not it's not like when if you get into losing source code or something, they're not behind big, massive vault doors, because they're just the tools that we use on the engagements, right? So like, you would grab a new version of those tools and drop it into your laptop when you were going to go do a red teaming engagement. And then you might muck with the tool or recompile it different or change its capabilities, right? So each individual engagement might have a slightly different version of it. But the starting point was hundreds of engineers that do this all day. You don't really worry about a publicly available tool like Cobalt Strike, somebody losing my version of Cobalt Strike. We believe that the reason why they took our tools was because they wanted to see how we impersonate them, right? So because of just how many, FireEye works something like 700 or 800 breaches a year. They're incredibly prolific on this stuff. And when you hire a red team, you could literally say, I would like you to impersonate APT 28, or I would like you to impersonate APT 33. And we could use the different tools in order to see what it is. Well, if you're that APT group, you now have bits and bytes of exactly how we're impersonating them, right? It's actually pretty useful for them. Good. Okay, now let's flip over the other side, because the Microsoft side of this is, I believe, actually, hang on a second before I do that one. SolarWinds side, there is an entire discipline around third-party risk. So in a GRC group, governance, risk, and compliance, third-party risk has been getting significantly worse for years now, because the auditors are asking your board of directors, the board of directors are asking your execs, and the answer is, how do you not buy, fundamentally insecure things? The reason why this one upends that totally, and I don't believe anybody has an answer for this yet. I have not heard an answer for this yet. SolarWinds, this whole campaign, they had thousands, tens of thousands of customers. This was actually only one of their products, the Orion product. Every branch of the US military used SolarWinds. Like dozens of US government agencies used it. Damn near all of the Fortune 100 used it. They were a very ubiquitous product because they had a good price and they were really good at what they did. Every single one of those companies and agencies, we all had third-party risk programs, and we all asked the good questions, and the answers were satisfactory, and that was a good idea. Trusting SolarWinds as a product that seems worthwhile was absolutely a good choice. But it was a piece of software that was installed, and it was the normal monthly update process. Actually, turns out almost a year and a half before was when the bad guys had access inside SolarWinds. We actually know that one because they released a file. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact date, but it was 2019. So this was happening at the end of 2020. 16 months before, the bad guys had released a file through their update process in order to prove that what they could do it, but it didn't do anything. It was just an innocuous file. That meant they had access before then, because they had to be able to get access, be able to understand their build environment. Think Jenkins, but they used a tool called Team Cities. And it was using their build environment the way build environments are meant to be used. So if you're going to release Orion, grab this source code, compile it, grab these other files, pull it in here. Bad guy inserts part in here that says, and if it's Orion, go grab evil DLL and drop that in. Right? It was there was no malware in this involved. They just configured their build environment to go include the malware. Right? That's terrifying. And if it's not terrifying to you, you should go figure out why not, because that is actually really, really horrible. So now when you think about like what we did on the two-factor auth token thing, I had the piece of automation. How would you configure a monitor in order to know whether or not your build process had been compromised? Because your build process is probably highly automated. It gets updates all the time, right? That's literally what it's for. How do you figure which ones are evil, which ones are not? That's where people get into zero trust environments. That's where like you could put neurotic levels of control on here and still not solve the problem. Okay. From the third-party risk angle, let's say you're a bank, you're Wells Fargo. How do you not buy a product that ends up turning into Solarwinds? And nobody has an answer for that, right? Your Oracle financial server could all of a sudden get your quarterly updates you're supposed to put in, and it's still a good idea to put in your updates. And then all of a sudden, that's your attack surface. I was talking, as part of me talking to customers and stuff, I talked to some governments. I talked to one Southeast Asian government. And it was like 6 different divisions of their cyber people from 6 different divisions of their government. And they're like, oh, we have ours in an air-gapped environment, we're fine. I'm like, no, you're not. You still have to update the thing. You would have put the evil DLL, you just would have sneaker netted it into your air-gapped environment. And by the way, it turned out they did. Now, the difference was that in this case, it didn't actually reach out to the command and control that way. There wasn't a way to get to the internet, which meant if you were going to be breaking into this air-gapped environment in this government, they would have had to do something else to trigger the DNS call out. This is also public information. The way it had to get out to the internet, and it was using DNS calls as to how it did command and control. So the URL that it hid told the attacker information about inside the network. And the DNS response included information as to instructions as to what it told the malware to do, right? Okay, now that whole third-party risk thing is exploding. Banks have hundreds and hundreds of jobs in there. I personally think a lot of the banks do it kind of awkwardly because they're still trying to make financial risk models work in IT, and I don't think that works. If you think a company that gives credit cards, there is no one credit card that you could lose more money than the available credit on that card. Well, if you're trying to use that kind of a model to do something like this, there is absolutely one piece of cheap software that could destroy your entire operational environment. It just is, right? So those models, I don't personally think that they give the output that people think they do. The really high-powered risk people, though, they would say that I'm wrong. They would say that they do actually give them the ability to steer in useful, monetarily weighted terms. Collegiate-wise, I just finished getting my second master's degree from Cal. Sorry, my university is better than yours. But there's a risk class that they have in this Masters of Cybersecurity program that gets into like the quantitative risk analysis and how to do all of that stuff. And it's kind of like, how do you have highly calibrated guesses that you then pin back to, okay, with educated, good, statistical models, how do you say, if I can't detect every single risk, which ones have the most relative risk to all the others, right? That's actually really possible to do. How should a small business balance risk versus expenses? What should a business individual do if they don't have access to high-level security? Brilliant question, by the way. I have a friend of mine that I helped do some advising for her company to do exactly that. If you don't have the money to do high levels of security, don't install hundreds of things. Just don't. limit your attack surface and do like, so think of it this way. If you're a small company and you know that you're going to have a problem with, if some advanced vulnerability comes through, I'm not going to have the people to do it. You should literally automate your patching day one. Like, just the second the patches come out, apply them out, because you have a very small chance of causing yourself an outage. But even if you had the outage, you know exactly what caused it. You know when the automation happened, you would just roll it back. Even better, you would be doing sort of like the 10 changes a day model of you'd have the way I'm running right now, and then the new patches come out. So I'm going to build the environment. I'm going to push that out automatically. And if I had a problem there, I just push it back out with the configuration from the first one. You're always rolling forward. You never have to roll anything back. You never uninstall anything. There's a book that makes this really, really good, and it's easy to digest, called the Phoenix Project. If this is the whole DevOps, I will say that in that book, the security guy is an idiot. So this is how to do IT at scale with DevOps principles. You really quickly see why it makes security better. And actually, the audiobook is actually pretty good too, because it's not a bunch of charts and graphs. You could listen to it while you're on a treadmill. Okay, I want to get to the Microsoft side because this is incredibly important. So when they're trying to accomplish their goal, what they were then got into was the Microsoft side of stuff. We were working through this whole investigation, and we got down to there being connections into the Microsoft Azure world, the Office 365 world, that were problematic to the point where when we were doing cleanup on kicking the attacker out, either we had missed something huge or Microsoft had a problem. So this was literally FireEye telling Microsoft, I think your cloud doesn't work the way you think your cloud does, right? Now, the Microsoft breach responders were outstanding. They were really, really good. And they took this situation very seriously. It helps that a couple of the people on the Microsoft team I have actually personally worked with. I drank beer with these guys, which made it one of those things where my breach responders and their breach responders, we just had a level of trust that made it a little better. It's also probably one of the contributing factors as to why FireEye was the first place in the world to find this, and literally was the one telling Microsoft, you need to go look here. Now, skipping some of the sausage making of the incident response part, what they got down to was the attacker was able to issue cryptographically valid SAML tokens as whoever they wanted in the domain. Now, from what I've read from other companies that were popped, because FireEye was absolutely not the first. In fact, I don't even think they were the 40th that had this particular Microsoft problem. Our blast radius was relatively small compared to some of the other ones. Now, when this exact same attacker was getting into the Department of Treasury, they had a different goal than when they were getting into DHS, had a different goal than when they were getting into the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission. All of those publicly said that they were breached as well. The ability to issue cryptographically valid SAML tokens as whoever you wanted. This attacker, remember I said their OpSec was really good. This attacker was trying to not get caught, to leave a very, very small trail of breadcrumbs. If you had a different attacker, you would have just ended up having a much bigger blast radius with a different kind of a goal. This attacker wasn't trying to break into the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission and ransomware. They could have, with the level of access they had, they could have just destroyed all the servers. They could have just deleted it all. That's like, it's all actually possible. Interesting note here, actually. The people that are the closest to the investigation, the FireEye Mandiant folks, the CrowdStrike people, because they worked some of the breaches to the other ones, they have not attributed this to a specific government. In fact, in both cases, they're, I think CrowdStrike calls it Holiday Bear, which is just a new Russian attack group. FireEye just has it as an unclassified group, which think of the unclassified group as a cluster of activities. But there are very high bars for how much technical confidence, like, high confidence in intelligence worlds means something. Like low confidence is more than no confidence, but high confidence has specific milestones. So the level of sophistication, the targeting, the victimology, all those kinds of things do actually point to the Russians, but until there had been any overlap in the infrastructure, the code base, the whatever, none of the private firms are actually attributing this to the SVR. The US government, however, has. Now, I have to assume that when the Secretary of State is saying that this is a problem with the Russian attack groups, that he probably had access to classified information that the rest of us don't have, right? It's really rare for, especially at that point, it was a Trump appointee, to be saying that this was a problem with the Russians. That's not common. And it also means that they would have had even higher bars than the private companies. Now, using those SAML tokens, and in career terms, think of this as all of the blue team stuff. How do you run the Active Directory environment, the mail environment, Teams, SharePoint Online, OneDrive? All of those things are all part of Azure Active Directory. How do you run those in a secure world, including all of the changes and updates and configurations that have to be done to do that? I will tell you, the world needs a hell of a lot more strong blue team people than it needs red team people. It's not quite as sexy, but there are probably 1,000 to 1 more jobs on blue team. So if you say I'm the mail guy, that's different than saying I'm the security relevant mail guy that actually can understand how to configure this in a way that's way less likely to get breached. I will say that Microsoft makes it a little easier. They have things like when you log on to the Office 365 score console, they give you a score. They have a security score and a risk score in order to be able to say, like, you might be, because they handle your patching for you. You never have to think about that. They get into what configuration do you have? Are you doing things insecurely? Are you using bad PKI? Did you allow logins to the consoles from anywhere in the world instead of limiting it to your own IP space, etc.? How has this attack changed the attack landscape going forward? Brilliant question, by the way. I believe, and a lot of other people believe, that this is one of those every 5 or 10 year generational shifts, right? In a lot of reasons. The entire cloud world runs off of SAML tokens, all of them. Like every single thing you like when you log into Google and then you click the button to go to your Google Drive, that's a SAML token. When you're logging into Salesforce, that's a SAML token. Everything in cloud terms is SAML tokens. And in this case, the whole world had been adding functionality more and more and more, and it was think death by 1,000 cuts. We all sort of agreed, yeah, it's nice to get that kind of cloud functionality thing, until all of a sudden you go like, holy crap, wait a minute. You mean the attackers could actually create effectively, the simple version of this would be they basically had figured out how to act like they were another domain controller and sync into the Azure AD off of this thing. But that meant that my AD controllers had nothing. There was no record at all of this. And the ADFS servers had no record at all of these things. And there was actually no log entry in Azure AD that would tell you off of this. One of the things that Microsoft still is doing badly in their licensing scheme that you get up through E5 is called. Most of the companies I've talked to are E3. You have to be E5 licensed in order to have access to the tools that would have given you any chance at all to find this. So Azure Sentinel, they have Defender for Identity, things like that. It's not common at all for you to say, you're going to buy this thing from me and you cannot secure it the way we tell you to secure it unless you pay me more. That actually is not common. And in the industry, pretty much everybody believes that Microsoft is screwing this up badly, right? You can't hold security behind a paycheck, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. We got 5 minutes left, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say, however, the Microsoft tools that they give you are actually pretty good. If you had to go, like literally the NSA had a piece of guidance that said you should monitor your environment for suspicious SAML tokens. That's like saying you should monitor your firewall for suspicious packets, right? There are billions or trillions of these things flying around. Go figure out which one's weird, right? Now, what the Microsoft tools do inside Azure Sentinel, they do have an awful lot of information in there, I think petabytes of information, about all of the inner workings and the guts. So like when, the tokens that might refresh every 5 minutes, there's an insane amount of logging in there. Well, of the billions of those in there, which 2 are the suspicious ones, right? What they do is they also on their GitHub publicly, they give you Jupyter notebooks where you can go ripping through APIs to go through that data, where you can say, okay, of the raging amounts of data in Active Directory, as a security guy, I probably don't care about sites and services. I don't care about replication. Those are all uptime things, right? Don't show me that. Then you go like, okay, now I still have billions of lines. I only want to look at my privileged accounts. Well, that's way smaller, way smaller. Now I want to look at ones that have access to mail or Active Directory. Okay, that's even smaller. And then they give you ways to, in this Jupyter notebook, it's like writing Python, right? Which I'm old enough to remember when we used to, have to chisel our logins into stone tablets, right? Like the Flintstones. Even I could do this one in Jupyter notebooks. They're not horrible. That's all very useful, but it's one of those things where if you're Microsoft, you're expecting that there are tens of thousands of people that work there that write code. If you're Target or Sony or Exxon, right, your job is not to write code. Your job is to do oil exploration or make movies, right? So the expectation that you just have hired all of the people that can write all of the things in all the custom ways, that's just not how it goes. Now, the Microsoft world is what they would say is that there will be new products built off of chunking through your Azure Sentinel, and you'll buy those products, right? And they're actually pretty proud of the fact that for every $1 Microsoft makes, their partners make $7. That's actually admirable. It is, right? So for all the ways that they try to lock you into their world, they then do actually make an environment that is possible to make better. All of those, like your question on how do they change the landscape going forward, all of those things matter a lot. They really matter, right? So if I'm buying this thing for all of the reasons I need cloud enabled collaboration tools and email and SharePoint and OneDrive and all the rest of that kind of stuff, how do I secure that? Because you figure if you're working for a company with 50,000 employees, that's a medium-sized city, right? Now go find the suspicious opening of a door in a city. I mean, like, how could you possibly police that, right? That's why we all have amazing careers. I think we have the coolest freaking jobs on the planet. This is exactly why we're going into this thing, because those are hard problems, like engineering, capital H, hard problems. And in most cases unsolved, right? There is no, if I know I had an evil login somewhere, I can now use Sentinel very well to go track down the rest of the stuff. How do you get that first thing that you go looking at, right? My explanation for finding patient zero for this attack sounds a lot like contract tracing in physical virus situation. Yes, absolutely. The only difference is contract tracing, think of that as those pivots back and forth, right? What it would get down to is you go like, okay, I'm pivoting back and forth. They're here, they're here, they're here. You can imagine you get to the point where you go like, all right, I know every single person that got COVID. I don't know which one had it first. That's what I'm talking about. Like, who's the one person that got it into somebody else? Because with incomplete data, you just may not have the social map that would figure out which human to wear, right? That's what I meant by patient zero. Think of it as if they get access to a specific box, they go from there to other places, and then they clean up their tracks so well, or maybe cause a hard drive failure so there is no tracks, right? You would never find that. It's literally impossible to find it at that point. A lot of log data takes up big space, absolutely true. How can one select and save only the good stuff? That's a career choice, what you just said there. The worst part of that one, and I'm almost out of time here. You have to be able to do that one for each individual technology, right? Your Slack logs are different than your Oracle logs, are different than your Workday logs. So there is no one answer. That, however, is a very good, think 1 week project where you go like, okay, what's the ontology of all possible events? Which ones do I want to store? And even more importantly, which ones are useful for alerting versus investigation, which you could store kind of half offline versus I don't need to store it all, right? And we're at time right now. Good questions, by the way. Those are pretty good.
Yeah,
Michael,
thanks, Stephen.
You can have your conference back.
Thanks for talking with us, Stephen.
And for anybody that was on here, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn and ask more questions there, that's perfectly fine. Talk to y'all later. Have a good weekend.